Now that we've seen a visual of what our k-means algorithm is doing, I wanted to walk through the steps of that algorithm just a little bit more precisely. So again, we're going to start out by imagining that we know that the right number of clusters to have is k. Let's assume we know that in advance, so we've got the k part right. We'll explore what happens when we have the k part wrong in our lab assignment that goes along with this week. But let's imagine that we know that we want to break our data into k clusters. And we are going to start and do a preliminary step before we start the repetitive part of this algorithm of just randomly picking places to put those centers for our k-means. We're then going to walk through every single one of our observations in the corpus and identify which of those k random points is closest to this particular point. So we'll take our entire collection of observations and we'll break it into k tentative clusters according to these random centers. So that's step 2. Once those clusters have been determined, we're going to take those totally random guesses that we started with and we're going to revise them to be what I would have called the centroid of that collection, which is if we have n data points that have been put into this tentative cluster, then we're going to compute the new x-coordinate by averaging all of the x-coordinates of the points that are in this cluster, and we're going to find the y-coordinate of the new cluster center by averaging the y-coordinates of all of the points that are in this cluster. And that will give us, for this given cluster, the best center. Then what we're going to go back and do is repeat steps 2 and 3 over and over again. Because in moving the center, it may be the case that one data point was closest to one center originally, but now that we've moved the data points, it's now closer to another. And as soon as we have either more or fewer data points in that cluster, where the best balancing point will change. And so steps 2 and 3 need to be repeated over and over again until really our cluster centers stop moving. And as soon as our cluster centers stop moving, we don't need to do this process anymore and the process can halt. Now, we might have some questions about this whole process, or as we explore further, there are certain things to come to mind. First of which might be, we showed a process, we watched it go through a few iterations and come to an answer, but is it going to be the case that the process that we've described is always going to find an answer? Or are there weird or interesting data sets that we can come up with that won't ever settle on where these cluster centers ought to be? Similarly, maybe we're going to find an answer, but are we going to find the best answer? Are we going to find the right answer? Or could we get drawn away, like we do in gradient ascent or descent, to other types of points? Something else we might be thinking about is just if we can always divide the data into natural clusters. There are lots of ways for us to see visual patterns and see clusters, but will this particular algorithm pick up on the same thing that we perceive visually? And last but not least, we've been running throughout this whole video under the assumption that we know exactly how many clusters we ought to use. We really aren't going to know that a priori, and so what are we going to have to do in order to figure that number out and get the right number of clusters to have the proper fit for our data? These are some questions I'd like us to think about and dive deeper into right now. So the first two have very nice answers. First of all, does this algorithm always converge? Yes. We're always going to be able to find a stopping point to this. We won't be making revisions and modifications to the centers forever and ever and ever. To oversimplify greatly, this happens because at each state we're improving. And you can't improve forever when you only have a finite number of data points. And so we are guaranteed that this process will eventually halt, which is affirming. But a better question is, does this algorithm always converge to the best answer? The answer to that is absolutely not. If you want to get back to that gradient ascent comparison for something that we've done before, we know that methods like gradient ascent and descent depend heavily on convexity or concavity of the function that we're looking at to know that when we get an answer, it's the absolute best answer. The function we're looking at here is not guaranteed to be concave or convex, and so there is absolutely no guarantee that the solution we find here will be optimal. In fact, there are many data sets where what is meant by optimal is not entirely clear. So there's a great picture of that over here on the right. If I look at the data over here and I were thinking about having 3 clusters, one possible way to divide this data into 3 clusters would be to very finely divide it over here, but to be much more generous with the cluster that's over here. Another thing that could be meant by our 3 clusters, sort of this one cluster that's over here, and to break this larger cluster up into these sparse points up here and these more centrally located points over here. Also, with this image, you see that there are some points that are not entirely clear what cluster they belong to. And so maybe it's possible that we could have a whole nother cluster that picks off just 1 or 2 of these down here, and we could end up with these 3 different clusters. And depending on where those random points are initiated in this image, we might get any one of these different clusters as our answers. So those random starting points at the beginning can really make a big difference as to the clusters you find. And that's something we'll want to think about as we study this algorithm more fully. So our algorithm is always going to converge, and that's very reassuring, but it might not always converge quickly, and it might not always converge to what we want it to. Now this problem exacerbates because there are plenty of problems where it might not find what our clusters are at all. So for example, what I have here in the colors is not necessarily what the algorithm converges to and says the clusters are, but what I have in the colors in these images are what the original clusters were. And then we say, could our algorithm find it? For something over here on the left, if these are our clusters, those are really nice, beautiful, easy clusters, and our algorithm should be able to pick those out. For something in the middle, if our clusters aren't really clustered and it's just 3 random collections of data points in this unit square that we've chucked all over the place, no, our k-means algorithm is not going to be able to separate these into this original state. Our k-means is going to produce something more like this. And if we had something over here, without the colors in there originally, it might not even be clear that there are 3 clusters there. And so it seems like maybe our data set could do it, but there might be a fair amount of confusion over the data points in the middle as to where they go, and we'll need to be prepared to make some mistakes in our algorithm. Furthering this, our algorithm is very Euclidean, the way that we've described it right now. Some data sets definitely have k-visible chunks, but our k-means algorithm is just not built for, in particular, curvy things. And so if we were going to run our k-means algorithm on anything that's broken up this way, where visually we see that there are clusters here that have a very beautiful pattern, the algorithm we've described using a Euclidean distance is not going to recover any of these things. Not because the clusters aren't there, but because our algorithm just isn't built for that type of measurement. So we have to be careful with when we want to implement k-means. It's a really great tool for some things, but it's not always the best fit for what our data may look like. And the very last question of, well, how do I actually know how many clusters I ought to run on this algorithm in order to get the picture right, should I be able to get it right, is a much more difficult question. And that's one I want to dive into a lot with more videos. And so that's going to be something that we save for next time.